Thank you very much. And as is customary, and it's an excellent custom, I want to thank the organizers, the people who did all the work to bring us together, and especially Leonard Harris for his provocative work, which is, forms the occasion for our discussion. So the title of the paper is Weathering and Marronage, Enduring and Escaping the Living Death of Necro-being. In his powerful argument, or article, Necro-being, an actuarial account of racism, Leonard Harris defines racism as a form of necro-being. Racism is, quote, a polymorphous agent of death, premature births, shortened lives, starving children, debilitating theft, abusive larceny, degrading insults, and insulting stereotypes forcibly imposed. Necro-being is, quote, that which makes living a kind of death. Or in another formulation, quotes, racism creates living death for masses of its victims. Yet again, racism as necro-being allows us to see racism as a killing machine. So the first connection I want to make, I think, with Deleuze and Guattari is that necro-being differentiates, and Deleuze distinguishes between a differential field, in that case, differentiation with a T, which basically means kind of distributed field, or even like a field of phonemes. There's only some of the differences between the two. And then what he calls differentiation with a C, right, which lines up with, well, here's a species of lions over here and a species of bears over there. That's differentiation with a C. Here, necro-being differentiates then and produces beneficiaries and victims. So Harris writes then in the sentence which will really be the jumping off point here. An actuarial account could allow us to depict racism as a life and death exchange. Victims as corpses, cumulatively persons being robbed of their body parts, and hosts for parasites of the same species. So I think this is the notion of actualization and the virtual multiplicity. You have a differentiation here along racial lines. And that distributes health and wealth in unequal portions. Now, I don't know whether Professor Harris talks about the movie Get Out, but that certainly seems to be one of the things where people are parasiting the vitality of the black population in that movie. So I'm going to talk about two reactions to necro-being that resonate with Deleuze and Guattari, so weathering and marronage. So the reason it connects, I think, with Deleuze and Guattari is I read them as biosocial thinkers. I think there's here and there throughout, certainly Anti-Oedipus and Thousand Plateaus, they'll talk about the materialist psychoanalysis, which they mean in the Marxist sense of materialism that you will, right? But I also think they do here and there say things like, we believe in the biochemistry of schizophrenia. They offer analyses at the genetic and even DNA levels. So I do think you can read them as a corporeal, biosocial corporeal thinkers. So weathering, I think, fits there, and most of this will be about how it resonates with Professor Harris, but I do think on that connection it resonates with Deleuze and Guattari. So weathering is a concept developed by the public health scientist Arlene Geronimus, denoting physical wear and tear from racialized being in the United States. With weathering, the multiplicity of racialized necro-being is physically instantiated in bodies of people subjected to disdain and disrespect. And there's both the, I think, the psychological notion of dignity at work, but also the collective conditions for notion of dignity. So weathering is measured by premature telomere shortening. And the telomere are the non-coding ends at the end of our chromosomes. And they protect against faulty replication. Now, telomeres shorten as we age in a calculable fashion, but the shortening is accelerated in racialized or ratiated populations. Among the candidate mechanisms for this are microaggressions, right, which constitute a drip-by-drip wear and tear on a brain region known as the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which regulates, among other things, everyone's favorite blame chemical, cortisol. Everybody knows about cortisol, and it is really bad if you live a life soaked with cortisol. And I think it's plausible that weathering contributes to the actuarial death rates that Harris talks about. It could be seen as a slow form of living death in people who endure necro-being. So in the book that's just been published, I did a case study on essential workers in the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the United States, there's overrepresentation of people of color in the healthcare workers and in the essential workers. Right? So that was quite a common critique of the who got to access distance work and who had to show up. So in that case, if you're forbidden from distance work, you are in a no-win or lose-lose situation. You could go to work and risk increasing your virus exposure, or you could quit work and risk financial ruin, because most people in those conditions are living paycheck to paycheck. It's quite in fact, sometimes there's a very nice book called The Time of Money, in which people live for the paycheck in order to get a line of credit. So when you apply for a credit card, right? So you're not even living paycheck to paycheck. The credit card, the paycheck enables you to get the credit card, which allows you to live. So that's the kind of double bind that people are in. So in the predictive processing idea, or the what do you call it? I'm forgetting the term. Well, there's a way in which you could take predictive processing and think of it as what your body constantly calculates in order to keep you within a homeodynamic set point. And I can't believe I'm spacing out on the term. But in any event, the idea there is if you have to calculate an escape strategy in a no-win, no-escape situation, you're going to be producing a set of chemicals that enable you to think faster and harder. Right? Among them, cortisol. So that lowers your synapse level, enables you to think more and more. But you can't do enough thinking. Thinking's not going to get you out of it. Thinking is going to wear your body out even faster, right? So there you get into the whole notion of rumination as a symptom of depression. You get trapped in your own head. We have a lot of everyday language for that. Somebody's living in their head. But living in your head, in that sense, is also wearing your body out. Okay, so Geronimus studied U.S. black women and telomere shortening. They talk about perceived stress. So here's her abstract. We hypothesize that black women experience accelerated biological aging in response to repeated or prolonged adaptation to subjective and objective stressors. We estimate that at ages 49 to 55, black women are 7.5 years biologically older than white women. So you have if you set your normal chronological aging on the white population, and then by how short their telomeres are, because that's just a normal practice, then you can see that there's an accelerated aging in raciated populations. So I think that this is a plausible mechanism for what Harris calls his actuarial account. Now this, and especially in this case study when I did a bit about black essential workers going to care for people in predominantly white hospital settings or nursing home settings. So the transfer is, quote, partly metaphorical, writes Harris. There's no direct unmediated transfer of health harms and benefits, no neat causal chain. They happen through the aegis of vast ranges of associations, probabilities, propensities, and relationships. So it's a plausible mechanism. It wouldn't necessarily be cashed out in every single case. However, it does seem to be at least a plausible mechanism for the population level that shows up with necro-being as a slow form of living death. Now, the problem I found with my case studies, I did the case study on one particular person, is that you're selecting on the dependent variable there. I looked for somebody who died from COVID, from her exposure at work, and adduced as a possible mechanism weathering in their using this thing. So you can't necessarily pin it down to individual cases, but it's at least, as I said, a plausible mechanism. Okay, so the next one then, I think has also a clear connection with Dr. Harris. So marronage is the form of living of those who escape enslavement. And Harris mentions this at page 172 of Philosophy of War and Struggle. Maroons in Florida, South Carolina, New Mexico, and Canada, among other places, Louisiana as well, were, and this is italicized in the text, successful insurrectionists, either in the sense of having achieved freedom through attacking civil supports of slavery or through organized resistance and escape. This is how Walker's spirit, inherited or not, lives. End citation. So I think we can do a short little bit on Hobbes, I think, to see marronage in the context of necro-being. So Hobbes argues that enslaved people are always in a state of nature. So the civil society, for Hobbes, is a political relationality or a topological thing. It doesn't have anything to do with a territory. The territory can be governed by a sovereign, but the people, no matter where they geographically are, enslaved people are not in civil society. It's topological. And so they quote, since they're not in civil society, they were not asked to sign a social contract. Hobbes is very strict about this. They have, quote, no obligation at all, but may break their bonds or their prison and kill or carry away captive their master, comma, justly. So Hobbes is an extremely hardcore guy. Enslaved individuals thus retain a full and unfettered right to resist through flight or violence. Now, in his debate with his Republican, small r, political opponents, Hobbes produced a very strict definition of slavery as physical impediment, that is, being in chains. So for Hobbes, a servant would not be a slave if they were released from chains. So many people that we would see as enslaved would be called servants by Hobbes. But there's a way in which he undercuts himself. So I'm relying on an excellent article by a guy named Daniel Lubin, Hobbesian Slavery. Says that Hobbes in Leviathan 14 lists 3 inalienable rights. You can never sign these away in any contract because these are the purposes for which you sign a contract. And those are, first, the right of resisting them that assault them by force to take away their life. So it's the right of self-defense. Everybody knows that one. Equally of resisting wounds or chains or imprisonment, right? So you can fight the cops if they're going to kill you, and they can even fight the cops if they're taking you to jail. Like Hobbes is really good about this. But the third one is what Lubin said. You can never sign away your right to, quote, the security of a man's person in his life and in the means of so preserving life as not to be weary of it. So I think there's the dignity aspect there. Right? It's not just your life in terms of they're going to kill you right now, but you have to have a life that you would not become weary of. Right? So I think that being weary of life would be the degraded life of those held in Harris's sense of necro-being as living dead. So we mentioned the Deleuze and Guattari connection. They do quote Soul Dead Brother, where George Jackson writes, I may run, but all the time that I'm looking for a stick, a defensible position. And there was a great ambiguity there that we discussed, is that my philosophical position of grab me arm, or literally, I'm going to find a place, right, that I can hold as my own, like a physical place. And Maroons did that explicitly. Right? So our old phrase, run for the hills, is literally true. Right? Because, and this is where James C. Scott would come in, you get a lot of enslavement when you have agriculture, and you can only have agriculture in places that could be legible and visible. The people on horseback who come in to see are these plots of land being read, they have to be able to literally see that. So you run for the hills, you get up in the forests, right? And they literally cannot see you. That's why you run for the hills. And then Scott has a bunch of great stuff about it. So what do you live on? Well, you can either hunt animals, or you can plant tubers, which are under the ground, which the state cannot see. Right? There's a bunch of great stuff about that. But it's not just run for the hills, it's also run for the swamps. We also run for the deserts. You could do dune, you could do a whole dune analogy. You could possibly run for the steppes as well, to bring in the reservoir. And you can run for the kind of littoral zones, the beaches, coves, small islands. So off the coast of South Carolina, you could see that as a Marooning site, because it's anything that imposes a cost on the pursuit by state forces, both in terms of time, money, and the ability to create a defensible position by which you can kill more of them than is worth them, than the lives that they're going to bring back to slavery is worth the captors. So you have to be able to booby trap, to slow, like as in Mad Max Fury Road, right? You get up on the cliffs and you throw rocks down at people. So Maroons, the anthropologists and the historians of Maroon societies, have shown the way in which they changed the physical qualities of their landscape in order to create these attack positions. So it's defensible, but also I'm going to defend my position in the sense of being able to impose more costs on the pursuers than is worth them. So I think you could add then mastery and marronage to the regimes of violence that Deleuze and Guattari enunciate. I don't think it's quite a war machine. It's not dedicated to destroying the state, but it's dedicated to a marginal position with the state. So a lot of Maroons ended up making treaties with states, or they wanted states because they could raid the states, or they wanted states because they could raid the enslaved population, bring them back, and replenish their own population. There are two ways for Maroon societies to replenish their population. One would be to wait for people to come up to them, right? A second one would be to go out there, grab some people, and bring them back. People they grabbed and brought back, they had to serve a kind of probationary period, because they didn't actually prove themselves worthy by escaping, and so they had to do that. And there was a form of kind of household patronage that some people accused the Maroons themselves of having enslaved the people who were formerly enslaved. I don't think it was quite that. It doesn't seem to be a chattel relationship, but more of a kind of household domination respect. But once you pass the probationary period, you could be brought assimilated into the thing. So you could say that space that they want is not purely smooth, it's not purely nomadic, it's not striated, it's not urban, it's not state. It's somewhat marginal and defensible is what they were after. And so that you could do both the regime of violence that they had and the geographical topology, the type of space that they create with that. So I think that marronage then forms a point in common between Dr. Harris, as he says, he mentions them, and also you could give a Deleuze and Guattari reading of that. So it's not quite to sum up, but a little bit. So in the violence aspect, then slavery is war. They're in the state of nature, as Hobbes says, and the state of nature is war. It's a system of terror. Slavery installs not just necro-being, but the inescapable consciousness of being subject to necro-being. Mastery, then, is the creation of a zone where lives can be taken or exposed to the threat of torture and death with impunity. And even more psychologically horrible, you know that your children are exposed to the threat of torture and death. It's one of the more devastating and obedience-compelling aspects of slavery. There's a distinction between torture and torment. Torment is when they make you watch your children being tortured, because it twists your mind. It's torment. Torture is when they twist your body. And torment is, by many testimonies, worse. So that's the slavery. So Marooning has its own regime of violence. Like I said, they will raid, they will have defensive war, they will have post-treaty capture and return. Sometimes they even made a deal with the enslaving powers that we will be your slave catchers. There's, the Maroons are now rehabilitated in Jamaica as national heroes, Queen Nanny and stuff, but throughout some of their period, they were not looked on with complete favor by the enslaved populations, because part of their treaty to protect their mountain zones was, when called upon, they would capture, chase and capture escaping enslaved people. So there's a lot we could say about the relationship with Marooning to the Saint-Domingue revolution that becomes the Haitian Revolution. One of the biggest case studies there is the Maroon community of Palmares in Brazil, which lasted for 150 years. So that's one of the most highly studied places. But the upland Jamaica and in Haiti, there's been a lot. And there's also been analyses of Marooning in the United States. The great, so-called Great Dismal Swamp between North Carolina and Virginia, I think, was a spot for Maroons. The bayous in Louisiana as well. And there's also a great twist where a lot, depending, you could do your Marooning by going to the city and blending in and or getting counterfeit papers. So Marooning is itself, while it has a heavy geographical thing where you run for the hills, you could also become imperceptible or indiscernible, as Deleuze and Guattari said, and blend in urban Marooning as well. And as Marooning has taken on this kind of multiplied sense of resistance and escape, you can see that used in contemporary Brazil for some of the favela people, right? Because that's basically a non-state situation, except when the cops come in with their tanks and helicopters. But by and large, it's kind of left on their own, what people call a no-go zone. So some people use Marooning in that relationship between the favela people and the state people. So it's become a generalized one. We know that Edouard Glissant uses it quite a bit, both in his theoretical work and in his novels, the 4th century. Sylvia Wynter has used it, analyzed by a guy named Greg Thomas. All right, so we'll wrap up there. I just wanted to say that weathering, you could see, is Necro-being that's become internalized even at the cellular level. And Marooning is successful insurrection against Necro-being. Here, what I analyze is a kind of external political and historical instances of it. And then we'd have to ask ourselves what would be spiritual Marooning. So my favorite line in all of Nietzsche is when he says that what had been the conflict, external social conflict of national and slave morality, is now internalized as the struggle to overcome your own resentment, and it's become internalized. So what would be Marooning as an internal spiritualization, right, of us overcoming, or at least learning to make connections, so to deal with living in a society that practices Necro-being. Okay. Thank you.
Just wanted to press back a little bit on whether or not Maroons are a war machine. And your claim, if I have it correctly, is since they were not committed to destroying the state, they're therefore not a war machine. Yeah?
Okay, so they're not a war machine in the sense that the nomads, right, created the first, or at least the point of highest intensity of the war machine. But after the incorporation of the war machine by the state and turned it into an army, the war machine metamorphosizes. So the final, and I don't want to call it the metaphorical, but the contemporary exemplification of war machines is the power of metamorphosis. You get that, I think, when he says the nomads re-territorialize on their power of deterritorialization. And that's literally deterritorializing, like moving, but I think you can also see territory as the formation of an environment that enables you to have a stable, or at least predictable, relationship between the features of the environment and your own habits. So I read deterritorialization as habit breaking. So you're most at home, your habit is to break your habits. That's what a nomad is, and that's what the metaphoricized, or what does it say? The war machine kind of disseminates after the incorporation of the external war machine, turned it into an army. Then he says it shows up in industrial revolutions and in artistic movements. So in that sense, yes, they would be war machines in that they're constantly having to create novel ways of detecting pursuit and inflicting costs on the pursuers. This, that, and the other thing. But I don't think they're against the state the way the nomad war machine is against the state.
I just take the against the state doesn't have to be this point of active conflict, right? The very fact that they're structured differently from the state is sufficient to make them.
Good. So in that case, yes, you're right. Because I want to have a metaphoric war machine and a kind of actualized state. But state for Deleuze-Guattari is anything that captures and anything that uses what Dan's three things. They don't necessarily have to be anything. In fact, what he says is you have to overcode, which creates equivalencies, and then you have to appropriate surplus. That's active capture as two heads. And so, but you can do that in lots of different ways. You do that with your own life, right? When you set up some sort of exercise regime. I'm looking at Jason. We had great conversations about that. But you can kind of make that into like a little rewarding, little reward system. You can kind of neoliberalize your own exercise capacities, right? If I go to the gym for an hour, I can have an extra cookie, right? So that kind of comparing and capturing and taking surplus may have started with the state and the laborers, but I think there's a way that you can statify even your own life. Like Nietzsche says, you can make your life into a work of art. You can also make your life into an enterprise, as Foucault says. We've had our life made into the self-entrepreneurial thing in which we're all making investments. And I'm definitely going home and putting this on my CV because that's the return on investment that my dean wants to see. I gave you a day off from work on Thursday. What am I getting for it? No, I'm also serious. I mean, where's Ken? But that's the capture that he was talking about when you're university philosophers, especially today. You have to write an annual report, and you have to quantify your activities. But we're doing it, not necessarily. We've made ourselves the state that oversees our own activity. And then you have to see whether you turn a profit. The thing about labor, right? He says it's entrepreneur and then profit. And then with money, it's tax and interest. And I forget what it is with land. It's rent and differential rent. But there's the banker, the entrepreneur, and the landlord, I guess. But there's again, there's a way in which you statify your own life. So in that case, definitely. I was trying to kind of fix the state as just the apparatus capture of land, labor, and exchange. But you can statify anything as long as you overcode it and then appropriate it. Lee.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. So years ago, Neil Roberts had "Freedom is Marriage," the book come out, and there was a criticism that came out there was a panel on it, and the charge was something like this: it's not really freedom. You're constantly on the run. You really haven't changed the value systems.
No.
You're constantly looking over your shoulder.
Yeah.
There is a sense that you have broken free from certain body, but you're not free. And so I'm wondering, particularly having read Deleuze Guattari, in the sense of releasing your powers and whatnot, how do you think about this, right? So do you think the marriage does get you there?
Well, I don't think that freedom is freedom from socialization, norms, causation, or anything like that. They have a different regime, and their regime of violence and of custom and of political orientation. It's a big debate in the Palmares literature about whether it was a republic or a kingdom. Did they just take African kingdom relationships and form their own kingdom? Or was it, there's lots and lots of stuff like that. But I would say they have a different regime, and a regime that they themselves in their actions showed was preferable to staying enslaved. Right? So that's their agency. They ran for the hills. Right? So it could be the sense that given the options they had, right, that difference of regime, it's not completely peaceful. There were, in fact, they were the punishments that the Maroon community laid out for anyone they suspected of being a double agent or suspected of having run away in order to were as horrific as you as those laid out on the plantations. So they're not. It's not a peaceful, noble savage kind of thing. But they were. It was preferable for the people who could get there to staying enslaved. So that would be what I would say.
Hi, John. Thank you. Fascinating as always. My question is about the weathering research in relation to Professor Harris's study and the microaggression stuff. And it just seems a little, it just seems strange to, although explicable, that the research focuses on microaggression to demonstrate weathering. It seems like, given all the other massive kinds of racist harm that Professor Harris lays out, and that we've seen in many presentations from, mass incarceration and other kinds of sort of system-wide things, that focusing on microaggressions to talk about weathering seems odd when there are all these really more massive things. And it seems like it's just like, well, because you can measure, you can ask people how many microaggressions they or it's like, it seems like the micro of the aggression is like marching into the micro of the cells. I mean, it's just, why focus on that in the research? Or is
I don't think that Geronimus necessarily does it, because she does say that there's repeated or prolonged adaptation to subjective, should be the microaggression, the microaggression, subjective and objective stressors. So she does put that in there. High blood pressure and diabetes and all sorts of things that tend to be overrepresented in African American culture. I think populations would also show up there.
But it's just not getting you anywhere near the kinds of larger forces of reality. That, yeah.
Well, no,
seems very-
microaggression is one way to explain weathering, but it's not the only one. And weathering is for her a way, for Geronimus, is a way to be a scientist. She's a public health scientist. She can write papers, and she can say, you might doubt me when I say that these people have accelerated aging, but let me show you my slides. So I think she
Yeah,
has
I'm pointing out what seems to me to be a limitation of the study with respect to, particular respect to the things that Professor Harris is talking about, because precisely because of what she's decided to measure, she's not measuring the kinds of things that I think she's talking about. I mean, in other words, that's not, from what you said, she's getting reports from subjects, and the subjects are not reporting, the results of, they're not reporting the large scale phenomena that are actually impacting for the actuarial account what's going on. They're not the large scale causes. They're just yeah. In fact, the individual doesn't necessarily know. You don't necessarily know if you're being ripped off for decades as a black farmer. You don't necessarily know that. You don't necessarily know that. You don't know sometimes. So to me, it's like it's interesting. It's important, but it doesn't hook up it's not hooking up for me with the scale of the kinds of actuarial. The scale of the causes of the actuarial account depicts, if not explains, or uses as explanations. Is that, you see what I'm saying?
Yes, no, definitely. I mean, I didn't mean to say that this is I've unmasked the cause of the actuarial account.
Yeah.
So if I gave that impression, that was wrong.
No.
But this is a plausible mechanism of what we do see in life expectancy and these other things. But I wanted to also say that this is a nice way of defeating people who say, well, it's just psychological. What's this microaggression stuff? You're just feeling sorry for yourself. You can imagine a kind of hyper-aggressive, denialist person coming along and wanting to poo-poo microaggressions, and she can say, among the things that contribute to weathering is plausibly microaggressions, and you can actually physically measure this. And so, it would be kind of but that's a deep embodiment idea that I don't like to see culture as coming on top of biology. Culture gets right to the bottom of our biology, and this is why I'm attracted to that research.
Yeah, I'm more about her methodology rather than your considerable of it.
Okay.
Yeah, I was interested in the question of what the spiritual marriage would be, and I was sort of, the thing that I like about the fact that like the two people or figures that are associated with like the line of light are both essentially killed. They're both murdered by the forces that they resist, and yet somehow they are the ones who are like offered as like paradigmatic of having achieved a line of light. And I think that like for me, there's something like quite beautiful in that, and in that so I'm just kind of in terms of like the success of like of the Maroons, and like how like ultimately different like that is one question, but in a way there's like something has already been achieved, right, in the sense of sort of maybe it's not like full deserialization,
Right.
but then it also feels as though the spiritual element is always the precondition, like the line of light is like a precondition for the war machine. I don't know, what do you think in terms of like where does the spiritual?
Well, let me go back to the emblematic figures of the people taking the line of flight. I mean, Len's done really nice stuff. Many of the lines turn out really badly. You end up alcoholic, and you end up suicidal, you end up fascist. there are dangers on those 4 lines. But I do think that there's one emblematic figure for the line of flight that they don't necessarily say too much about, but I think that you could certainly talk about, and it's something that Mary Beth and I discussed on the bus, is Dora in Freud's case study, right? She just leaves Freud. That is a great line of flight. Now, was she still suffering neurotic somaticizing symptoms in her new marriage when she left Vienna? We don't really know too much about the rest of her life. What was Ida Bauer's life after she left? But she left for it. But I don't know if people have followed up on that, actually. I just kind of read the case study and then she leaves at that thing. But no, Jackson is killed. Palmares is overturned. The Jamaicans do make a go of it. The upland windward Maroons were resisted incorporation until they finally became part of the nation. It's not guaranteed. But again, like I said, I do think you can read off of from people's actions their preferences, and that's an important thing.
All right, well, let's thank our speakers. Now